Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Odinic School of Mysteries. My name is Bear. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate the fact you've taken the time to sit down and listen to me talk for a little bit. So, this is basically a part two of last week's episode where we were discussing the Freemasonry. We're doing kind of a brief overview with Freemasonry. And, Freemasons have just a shit ton of freaking symbols and stuff we could go over. And so I picked two of them really to spend any amount of time on. I did a very brief overview of the first degree tracing board and did a very quick go over of the square and compass symbol. And today we're going to actually spend a great deal of time picking apart the first degree tracing board piece by piece. This requires a little bit of a shout out. I stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to this stuff. I owe a big thank you to the work of Mark Passio and Manly P. Hall and others who have done the work so that I may know. So, I'm not saying that I haven't done any research and I haven't, read books or anything like that. I'm just saying that I owe them a great debt of gratitude. And, I don't know that I need to say this, but I think it's worth saying anyway, that I am not a Mason. I'm not. I come out of an entirely different esoteric school. And even though I would say that the overarching story is the same, like what the story is actually trying to do, where it's trying to get you, is the same. It is different in the sense that that some of the symbols and that kind of stuff is slightly different. So, even though I would say that I have a great deal of experience in this field, I just feel like it just bears saying that I'm not actually a Mason. And so I don't want to run the risk of misleading anyone or making people think that I'm more into know than I am. I have done hundreds of hours of research into this, but I'm not myself a Mason, and I would never claim to be. So, with that said, I think it would be kind of great to get started. Before we start digging into the first degree tracing board, let's just do a quick recap. I think it's worth going over just to kind of get people back on the same brain train that we were in last week. So the dying god myth of the Freemasons, and like I said, all mystery schools are based around dying god myths. All religions, for the most part, are based around dying god myths. Even ones you wouldn't really think of as dying god myths, such as Buddhism, is still essentially a dying god myth. What we're dealing with here is essentially the story of the unenlightened, interred man who gets himself into trouble, who is in base consciousness, who comes out of darkness and into the light. That is essentially the story. That's the story of Buddhism. That's the story of Hinduism. That's the story of Odinism. And same story with Freemasonry. A dying god myth doesn't necessarily have to have an actual quote-unquote god in it, as I'm sure you know. So the dying god myth of Freemasonry is Hiram Abiff. And a lot of these stories are based on, there's always multiple levels, right? So on one level, it's just a story. Another level, it's a symbol for the acquisition of wisdom and consciousness. A lot of these are also, excuse me, I apologize. A lot of these are sun symbols, which we'll get into a little bit later. this always ties in. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. These tie in a lot with astrotheology and sun symbolism, which we didn't really get a chance to really get into very much yesterday, unfortunately, and we're not really going to have much of a chance to really get into them today even. We'll get into a little bit because it has a lot to do with the first degree tracing board, but unfortunately the astrological portion of his story we just didn't have time for, and that's really, really sad, and maybe we should revisit that at some other time. So for now, I'm just going to say that Hiram Abiff is an emblem for the sun and the solar aspect, the illumination principle, the transformational principle, the principle that takes you out of base nature, burns off the excess nonsense, and so you can fly into the heavens, into the Stargate, so to speak. And so remember the way the story goes is that Hiram Abiff, he's the Master Mason, and the Master Mason has this secret word that does all this magical stuff, such as, sorry, I'm speaking kind of fast, I'll slow down. I always have to remind myself because I get going and get excited, and then I start talking too fast. All right. All right. Hiram Abiff. You'll remember that his dying god myth consists of the fact that he was murdered by the three ruffians. Remember, their names were Jubilah, Jubilu, and Jubiloom. I went back and looked it up because I was embarrassed last week, if you remember, that I couldn't remember what their names were. I knew there was a lot of Jubals in there, but for some reason when I recorded my last episode, I was in the middle of a 3-day fast, and I was not thinking to the best of my ability. So anyway, yeah, their names were Jubilah, Jubilu, and Jubiloom. And I know it sounds silly, but they wanted the secret word of the Master Mason. And the secret word has all kinds of fun properties, such as being able to raise the dead, allow someone to fly. It could open any lock. It could open any door. It does all these magical things. And they wanted this power. They wanted the power of the Master Mason. Well, they tried to force Hiram Abiff, this solar wisdom symbol, to give them the secret word. Well, he doesn't do it, and so they murder him. They hit him in the chest and in the throat, and then finally they hit him in the third eye. And they hit him in the third eye with a mallet, and he gets hit, and he turns to the west, and they hit him in the third eye. The west is the place of death, where the sun goes to die, and that's where they hit him in the third eye, and the lights go out, and he dies. And then King Solomon, upon hearing this, sends out his 12 helpers, which I don't remember if I had said last week or not. But there's a lot of stuff to cover last week. So King Solomon, finding out that he died, he sends out his 12 helpers to go find a Master Mason or a Mason who could resurrect him. And so they try the interred apprentices, and that didn't work. They tried the fellow crafts, and that didn't work. Then after many days of searching, they finally found a Master Mason, and that Mason whispers in the ear of Hiram Abiff the secret word, and upon hearing the word of wisdom, the dead Hiram rises out of his grave and into the light of Gnosis. Right. And that's the way that goes. So the and that's the story. So, and then you also remember that the secret word is equilibrium. And the thing about this kind of thing with these keys is that even if Hiram told the ruffians what the secret word is, they wouldn't actually be able to do anything with it. There's this idea of a locked door in the mysteries, where you have to have a key and you have to have a door. And the key is one thing, the door is another thing, and without both, you can't get to the information that's behind the door. You have to have both things. So just knowing a word isn't going to buy you anything. In fact, it's going to be just as useless as not having it. It's not until you have the requisite understanding, the philosophy, and the heart change, and the mental alchemy change, that you actually really get to know what's behind the door. And in this case, even if Hiram spilled the beans, the ruffians wouldn't have bought themselves anything in any real way. And then we also talked about the Masonic history, and how my personal belief is that they're formed out of a ragtag group of different mystery schools that were kicking around Europe, that the stragglers of these different mystery schools after the Catholic Church had basically burned and tortured and did horrible stuff to all the initiates over a couple hundred years to 1,000 years. And they were kind of born out of all of that, so a little bit of Templars, a little bit of, old Christian sects such as the Gnostics and the Cathars, and, the Jewish side of things, the Kabbalists, and the, some of the Christian mysticism, some of the Middle Eastern mysticism, and some of the Egyptian mysticism, and all of that just kind of comes together into kind of an amalgamation of this weird hybrid thing, that became the Freemasons. And so that was kind of my opinion on that. We also talked about how the Masons, by and large, anymore, are just a sorting house and a boys' club, that the true esoteric Freemasonry, for the most part, has largely gone, though there are still a few of them kicking around. It's not the same group as it used to be, and which is really sad and regrettable. That just because you have a 33rd degree ring doesn't actually mean anything. So, in my opinion, again, I'm not a Mason, but I did the work. I had to do all this stuff, and they, I know from some personal experience that even people who aren't in the Masons know a lot more than the Masons do, and that is really sad. That is really sad. Like one of my heroes, Manly Hall, I just mentioned him a minute ago. He was never a Mason, never stepped foot in a Masonic lodge, but they gave him, towards the end of his life, they gave him an honorary 33rd degree Masonhood, because he, on his own, figured out the symbology, figured out all the symbols, and became essentially the highest rank possible. So, you don't have to be a Mason to understand Masonry. Don't let them fool you. It's, if you have an eye for symbols and you have an eye for esoteric philosophy, this stuff is perfectly knowable outside of the lodges. All right. Anyway, so that was kind of our little quick, I don't know, was that 10-minute recap or something like that for the stuff we covered yesterday. We also talked briefly on the square and compass symbol, and very briefly we talked about the first degree tracing board that we're going to cover in depth today. You recall that the square and compass symbol was a symbol for the mind. The square represented the base consciousness, a downward pointed spear, base consciousness, the unbalanced pyramid, the Abdullah, that lower brain, the primal brain, the fight or flight, need to feed, sex-crazed portion of the brain, and the compass represented the neocortex and the pineal gland, and the G represented the generative principle, or the principle of care, the wisdom principle, the principle of wonder, that generative portion of the mind that creates new things out of nothing. All right, so that's our quick recap here. So now we're going to go into the first degree tracing board. Now, unfortunately, even though I try super hard to arrange these things in a way that even if you're listening on the podcast and don't have access to pictures and stuff, I try really hard to explain things in a way that allows a person to just hear and understand. But unfortunately, the symbol is super complex and there really isn't much of a way around it. If you really want to get the most out of this, you're going to have to, go to my website, and I have normally I would say just do a Google search and you'll see it. But unfortunately, there is a great number of tracing boards, and if you want to know this very specific one that I'm talking about, I have it on my website. So in this case, I would really highly encourage you to go to my website. It's on the charts to download page. You could look through the pictures there, and you'll see it right away. That is something I really highly recommend, because you won't really get the most out of this unless you are willing to actually look at it and see it. All right, so there's a few things right off the bat we notice. We notice that on the edges, on each edge, that there is a direction. You have a west, you have an east, you have a south, and you have a north. So that is an important clue about the way to read this symbol, that it is that the directions are actually important. We see a checkered board floor with a number of implements kind of scattered on the floor. You have a pillar on the left with an S on it. You have a pillar on the right with a B on it. We have 2 cubes in the background. We have a ladder. We have 3 people on the ladder, and we have a key. And then above each pillar, above the pillar on the left-hand side, we have a sun. Above the pillar on the right-hand side, we have a moon and stars. And above the center pillar, we have a eye with rays of light coming out of it. So there's a lot going on here. And then I don't know if I mentioned the checkerboard floor or not. So in esoteric symbology, the things that are highest on the page is most important. The things that are lowest on the page is least important. The things that are on the bottom usually typically represent the lowest form of whatever it is trying to be represented. The things that are on top are known to be the highest form or highest ideal based on the thing that is being represented. So like you could think of, for example, if I showed you a picture of a king, the crown is at the top, and then you always have subjects kneeling on the floor or something like that to show that they are the lowest version of the principle. But if you saw a king and his crown is on the ground, well, that is something entirely different. That indicates that his royal standing, his divine right to rule has been removed, his sun symbol has been thrown into darkness, that sort of thing. So on the lowest point of the page, we see the checkerboard floor. Now, and it's also, you'll see the checkered floor is also black and white tile. And now this is done on purpose. So this represents a number of things right off the bat. So this represents the dualistic black and white nature of the unenlightened man, the person who has no nuance in their thinking. All right. This represents interment. It also represents Saturn. Squares, cubes, those kinds of things with hard edges typically represent Saturn. Not always, but very often they do. It represents, because Saturn is also called Yaldabaoth in Gnosticism. It's the god of the blind. It's the god that rules the processes of the Abdullah. The worship of earthly, it's basically the worship of carnal pleasure, the worship of ego, and the worship of the self. So it's like in a number of Catholic churches, for example, like you remember, I can't remember which church it was, but the royal wedding with Kate and William. I don't really follow royalty very closely. I think it's William. Someone out there is going to correct me, I'm sure. Anyway, you'll notice that there is this beautiful red carpet that the royals get to walk on, but then you have that black and white checkered floor of the church where all the peasants have to stand on. And that's basically symbolic mockery, right? That the royals are enlightened and full of gnosis and wisdom, and then the rabble of the populace are represent, darkness and dirt and unenlightenment. But more specifically, this represents someone who's ignorant of law, right? This is the kind of person who has a huge inflated ego, and they get into bar fights all the time, and they can't figure out why their wives leave them and why the cops keep picking on them. This represents like the woman who keeps dating morons and can't figure out why her relationships don't work out. This is the person who is obsessed with pornography and then can't figure out why they can't actually get sexual pleasure when they actually achieve sex. There is just a lot of that kind of thinking that goes into this checkerboard floor idea. And so the checkerboard floor is lowered to earth. It's the very bottom section. Okay. That's what that represents. It's the lowest ideal possible. And you'll notice it sits down on the side of the west, where west is the place where the light dies. The light being, again, is the transformational principle, is the principle of enlightenment, the principle that takes the base consciousness, burns off all the excess through the process of mental alchemy, and then the dirty lower mind burns away, and then the divine part gets to go into heaven. So that's the checkerboard floor. And you can see this in a lot of, hidden in a lot of cult symbolism. Like you'll notice, whenever you have two squares, again, this isn't always the case. So, your local barber isn't going to be trying to making fun of you or whatever. But, so it's not always this. You have to kind of keep in mind where you are. But like you'll notice, like the stop sign, for example, an octagon is two squares, one on top of each other. And if you start paying attention, you'll start seeing this quite a bit, where a cube even is basically essentially squares kind of all stuck together. And that is, like the symbol for Jack in the Box, for example. Jack is an everyday man, and a box is a symbol for unenlightenment, lower thinking. And so by eating at Jack in the Box, they're very simple. The very name is an occult mockery of the people who actually eat there. That is, if you just look around and pay attention, you'll see this kind of stuff quite a bit. All right. So then, moving up, we have the 3 pillars. Now, these 3 pillars are the same. There's a number of names for these. These are also, this symbol is very ubiquitous and is ancient, actually. We find this same arrangement in the standing stones at Göbekli Tepe. It's like and that is the oldest megalithic structure we have found to date. It predates the pyramids by several thousand years. And this same setup is there. It's slightly different. The center pillar is a little bit shorter than the 2 on either side, and there's a little hole cut in the middle of it, so that the sun at the summer equinox comes through the hole, and it creates basically this eye symbol you see above the center pyramid here. It's a very ancient symbol. These aren't things that the Masons made up on their own. These are symbols that have been known to mankind in the mystery schools since the very beginning of the time when the gods were still here. Okay. So the pillar on the left, we'll start with that one. It has an S on it. The S stands for strength. And if we were dealing with Kabbalism, like I mentioned that the Jewish Kabbalah is a part of Masonry, this would be the pillar of severity. But the official name of the pillar is actually the Joachim pillar. And it's the solar pillar. Like you'll notice that the sun stands just above it. And this pillar represents the masculine principle. The masculine principle. So things that are knowledge that is considered masculine is things that are very easily quantifiable on a piece of paper, is the way I like to put it. Very concrete knowledge, things that are very straightforward. So math, science, logic, that sort of thing. Linear time, that is considered masculine knowledge. And so if you look at the very design of this pillar, it's actually the actual kind of pillar that it is called a Doric style pillar. But it's very linear, it's very simple, it's very plain, it's a very masculine symbol. And again, its attributes are called strength, which is what the S stands for. Also severity. And severity is the left-hand pillar of the Kabbalist tree of life. The right-hand pillar, the B, it has one with the B on it. It stands for beauty. Beauty. And its official name is actually called the Boaz pillar, and it's a Corinthian style pillar. So like there's a lot of names here I'm floating around, I know. but this is the feminine pillar. The Boaz pillar is the feminine pillar. And you'll notice that just above it is the lunar, the moon and stars that sits just above the feminine pillar. And the reason, like you'll notice that the design of the Corinthian style pillar is that of it's, you see, like there's a lot of floral arrangements on it. It's very beautiful, and that's because the feminine principle comes out of the beauty side of things. That knowledge that is specifically feminine are things that are not knowledge that is not quantifiable on a piece of paper. So things like eternity, infinity, art, love, compassion, the knowledge that comes from a mother's hug, that sort of thing, where it's still knowledge, it's still it's still very applicable and important, but it's not quantifiable. It's not something that you can just look at it and do the math and figure out. You can't do the math to figure out or quantify the effect of a mother's hug. You can't do it. And that's why, like, for example, truth, for example, wisdom gods are usually masculine and truth gods are usually feminine. That's why you have, let's say, Thoth, for example, the wisdom god of Egypt, is married to Maat, the truth goddess of Egypt. They're married together. Truth is married to wisdom, and there's a reason for that. And the sun, or the moon and stars represent the feminine, and that is because the moon and stars, the nighttime basically, is what gives birth to the sun in the morning. So it's very those principles are very important to understand. And I feel like now, for some reason, the Kabbalist name for this pillar escapes me. I think it's subtlety, but I don't know. For some reason, I can't remember it. I have a few notes in front of me, but I don't have, for some reason, didn't write that one down. I don't remember. And then we have the pillar in the middle, with a W on it, and that represents wisdom. And that particular pillar is called an Ionic pillar. And you'll notice that its architecture is a mix of the feminine and the masculine. And so this becomes a mind symbol. The three pillars of this become a mind symbol, where you have to have an equal balance of the masculine and you have to have an equal balance of the feminine in order to achieve wisdom, in order to have that third eye open up, which is a mix, you'll notice, of both the lunar and the solar principles, where those two things, they mate with each other, and then the Stargate opens up with the all-seeing eye in the middle of it. We just talked about the all-seeing eye just a few episodes ago. If you want details about what the all-seeing eye represents, please go and check that out. It is certainly worth your time. All right, so you'll remember we talked about the upward pointed pyramid, about if you have an equilateral triangle that's pointed upwards, that is a wisdom symbol because it is equally balanced on both sides. So like you'll notice at the bottom of the wisdom pillar, you have the upward pointed square. When the square is upside down, it's a symbol for disunity, unbalance, and the opposite of gnosis. The shining tip of the spear of Odin, for example, is buried in the ground. And in this case, this is kind of a reverse of like the square and compass symbol, because now you have the compass actually laying directly on the checkerboard floor. And so you have the neocortex, which is laying on the floor, which means it's in disunity and gnosis. And you have the square, which usually represents base consciousness, is now upright and pointed upwards right at the wisdom symbol, the W. And there's like, say, you can see like a map there on the ground of the Temple of Solomon, and there is a level and I think that is, I'm not sure what that other one is. The level is on the B pillar, and I'm not sure what that one is there on the S pillar. And I'm not exactly certain what those represent. I do have notes somewhere in my archives that tells me what each of those represent, and for some reason, preparing for this video, I couldn't find them. So that is there is a specific reason for those, but for some reason I couldn't find those. You'll notice in the background, there's these two cubes. One is all jagged and broken up, and one is straight-edged and clean. Those are called ashlars. They're like the bricks in which the temple is built. So you have the unfinished ashlar, which represents a person who is still unworked and is still in base consciousness. And then you have, over here, you have the finished ashlar, which is the person who's gone through the mystery school system and has achieved gnosis. Like you can even see sitting on top of the finished ashlar a little lantern. And that represents this person has reached enlightenment. So already we've gotten not very far into this, and already there is just a lot going on in this picture. There's a lot going on in this picture. So you'll look down here at the base of the ladder. There is a book, there is the square and compass symbol, and there is a circle with a dot in the middle of it. Now, a circle with a dot in the middle of it is called a circumpunct. If you're my son, I would say, can you say circumpunct? Circumpunct. A circumpunct, it's one of the oldest Neolithic symbols for the sun ever. It is literally one of the oldest symbols in human memory that we still have. And it represents the sun. It's also the alchemical symbol for gold, which should be to no surprise to anybody. And again, that represents that transformational principle, the principle of alchemy that takes the base consciousness, the base material, and burns it off until you get to the shining sun, when you burned off all the base material and you get gold out of it, the turning lead into gold, which is what they say alchemy is based on. That's what that symbol is. It represents the completion of that process. And we could, of course, go into it in a lot more detail later. We did talk about it a little bit in the All-Seeing Eye video. But the short version is that's what that represents. It's that golden solar high gnosis principle. And then you have the square and compass, which is the mind symbol. It's a symbol for the mind. And then you have also that book that the mind is sitting on, which basically, in short, for now, we'll just say it represents gnosis. And so you have the ladder that stretches from base consciousness that's resting on top of, excuse me, you have the ladder to heaven, which is called Jacob's ladder. And you have this ladder to heaven, which rests on basically three gnosis symbols. The symbol for gold and enlightenment, the book, which represents knowledge, and the square and compass, which represents mind. So it's saying that the stairway to heaven is this gnosis, knowledge, mind principle. This unification principle that gets you out of your internment, out of the underworld, which is basically what the checkerboard floor represents, and the ladder to heaven is resting upon it. And it is also resting upon the wisdom pillar on its way up to the solar principle. Okay. So now the thing to remember is that these kinds of symbols are alive. They're not static. So the first question, one might have is, you see the three initiates there standing on the ladder into heaven. And so the question one might have is, well, are they climbing the ladder or are they coming down? The answer to that is, well, it's both. It's depending on which, I've always said, and I've said over and over again, and many of you will remember this, that the death and life death and birth are exactly the same phenomenon. They're exactly the same phenomenon. You're born in one place, you die in the other. You die in one place, you're born into the other. They're exactly the same phenomenon. And this represents that principle where you have basically the sun symbol, like you see down there on the checkerboard floor at the base of the ladder. You have the sun symbol right there, and then you also have the sun symbol at the top on the upper left hand side, way up in the sky, at the top of the ladder. So you could look at this as either people coming out of the sky, losing their divine principles as they come into the underworld, into the world of base consciousness, or you could see this as people gaining knowledge and gaining their divine principles as they climb up to the sun, up to the Savior. So it works both ways. So on the first rung, you have these are called the three initiates. And this is a very ancient symbol. We even see it, in Christian mystery school philosophy, there's the three kings. The three kings that bring the three gnosis symbols just before the birth of the sun in the East. Right? They come from the East to the West to meet the sun on his birth. Okay. That's why they come from the East. It's this old symbol. However, which is really interesting about this, the Bible never actually specifies how many kings there are. We just take it for granted that there's actually three kings there, but the Bible never actually specifies how many of them there were. It just says what the gifts are: frankincense, gold, and myrrh. But that's because the three portion of that is a mystery school symbol. It's a mystery school symbol. It's not actually in the text. It's part of the Christian mysteries. There's a number of those little things that people assume is actually in there when in fact it doesn't actually say. Another one of these, if you want an example of another one, is that the Bible never actually specifies where the first Temple of Solomon was built. It's assumed, people just assume, that it's on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Bible never says it was in Jerusalem. It never says where it was built. Weirdly enough, I'm not making a truth statement here, but it's a curious phenomenon that the Temple of Luxor matches the same dimensions, so I'm told, as the Temple of Solomon. So a lot of alternative thinkers think the Temple of Luxor in Egypt is Solomon's temple, but you believe that or don't, I'm not really married to that information. I just thought it was kind of an interesting little what if thing. So, those of you who are waiting for the third temple to be built in Revelation, and you're waiting for it to be built on the Temple Mount, it doesn't have to be built on the Temple Mount. People will argue with me, go for it, but that's just a brief side rant. Anyway, how did I even get on that? Somehow I got off on that. Oh yeah, the three initiates. Yeah, it's an ancient mystery school thing. So you have the three fates in Greek mythology. You have the three Norns in Norse mythology. You have the three kings, which is actually an astrological sign. It's the three. You have the three. You have the three stars of Orion's belt, which points to the North Star, or which points to the sacred star, which is always Sirius. the Norse god is Odin, is represented by the star Sirius, and then that star is the star that signals the place of the birth of the sun on solstice. So if you are in the Christian mysteries, you'll recognize the Christ as a solar symbol side of their mystery school system. And just like with all of these wisdom gods, there's always typically a solar side to them. It's the same thing with Hiram Abiff. It's the same thing with Balder. It's the same thing with Odin. It's the same thing with Osiris and Horus, and all these wisdom gods all have solar aspects to them because of that gnosis light transformational principle that's associated with it. And I know that it gets rather deep in there. The symbolism gets really complicated and it's hard to follow. As I say all the time, this doesn't mean you're stupid if you don't understand it. It just means that it's complicated and it's new information. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. I must swallow air when I talk or something like that. Anyway, so the three initiates are ancient. We, in the Norse system, we don't have three initiates per se. We have, it's a little bit of a fractal, but you have the three rites before you leave the underworld, and then we also have the three gates before you reach Asgard. And if you're on the YouTube channel, I've had a couple of videos about the world tree and how it's broken down, and you could go look that up. If you are on the podcast, I think I feel like I've done one fairly recently. I don't remember, but I'll try, and if I haven't done one, I'll do another one for the podcast audience. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to say is that that's the three things that must occur before you gain entrance into the heavens. This is not a new idea. It's a very ancient idea. And this is just another example of how the Masons integrated other mystery school ideas into their own. That's why I say over and over again, they're this amalgamation of many different mystery schools, which doesn't make it bad. It just means that there's a lot of old doctrines in there that are worth looking at. So you have the first initiate that's sitting on the first rung, and who is the first rung just above the kind of that stack of gnosis symbols: the sun, the mind symbol of the square compass, and the book. That's called the entered apprentice. The entered apprentice, and I talked briefly about green language, and this is something that Mark Passio discusses. If you ever follow his work, he talks a great deal about green language or occult wordplay. It's very common in occult circles for wordplay. They like language, they like knowledge, and so you get into that enough, you start playing with it. The entered apprentice is wordplay for the interred apprentice. Interred as in like you are interred in a grave. You're interred in the underworld. You're buried in the underworld. It's the dead apprentice. It's the dead person who wants to be a live person, which is why it's sitting on the mind symbols down there on the base, on the checkerboard floor. And you see it's raising its left hand. It's pointing up towards the lantern there on the ashlar, and the left hand is a feminine principle, and the feminine principle represents the feminine is the part of creation that gives birth to new things. And so by raising its left hand is the birth of new things. Okay, so the death being birthed into life. You'll see that this person has a book on its lap too, which again is a left hand raised to heaven, which is the feminine birthing principle, and it's can't tell if it's a boy or girl, but this particular initiate has the right hand on a book, which is the masculine principle and the logic principle. So then halfway up the ladder, you'll see another apprentice, the second apprentice, and this apprentice is holding an anchor, and the right hand is being raised to heaven in this case. Now the anchor, depending on which direction this person is going, if they are coming down the ladder, then they're holding on to the anchor, and the anchor is pulling them down to the earth. And I don't know a lot of specifics about what the anchor represents. I'm looking into buying a book on that goes into a great deal about Masonic symbology here soon, so hopefully I'll know a little bit more. But to my understanding, what my limited understanding is that this is the principle that pulls you to earth, or lets you go. You let go of the anchor so you could fly to heaven, or you hold on to the anchor and it pulls you to earth. You know, it's that part that kind of that gets you. And you'll see that just behind this apprentice. It's called the the second apprentice is called the fellowcraft. I didn't mention that, and I apologize. It's called the fellowcraft. So this person is holding an anchor in the left hand. The thing that will cause it either to not be born or to be born, depending on what it's doing with which direction down the ladder you're coming. And then behind it, you'll see a sash with a G on it. And then just above the G, which we covered in the last week's episode on the square and compass, about the generative principle. And then just behind this apprentice, you also see a key tied to the rung of the ladder. And so this apprentice has its right hand raised to heaven. Its right hand is raised to heaven, pointing up to the... from here, it looks like it's pointed up to the all-seeing eye, but it could also be pointing up to the sun. In either case, it is pointing up to gnosis. The solar principle, the right hand, is always, the wisdom principle is always considered masculine. The right hand side of the person is considered masculine. And so it would make sense that it's pointing up to the wisdom principles up above this person. And the G, of course, is is called the generative principle. I think I'm told by some sources, again, I'm not a Mason, so I'm taking this just on this person's word, that the when you first join the Masons, that the G is called geometry, is the first thing I'm told that they're taught. I don't know if that's true or not. That is just what I've been heard. And Mark Passio says something similar, that when you first join, that is the what you're told. But the real meaning for that is the generative principle, or the principle of creation. Like the principle of care. You have to care enough to get up off your butt and do something with your life. You have to care enough to do the research and do the reading. You have to care enough to want to be set free. You have to care more about being set free than you do about being comfortable and enslaved. Right? That principle of care is a necessary principle. It's also called the wisdom principle. The generative principle is also called the wisdom principle, because without I'm sorry, I said wisdom. I could tell I'm getting excited and talking fast again. The generative principle is also called the wonder principle. That's what I wanted to say, not wisdom. I'm sorry about that. Because without wonder, without saying, I wonder, nothing new happens. Nothing new is created. You don't have that sense of wonder is what drives a person into learning something brand new and something exciting, and to grow and to seek more and know the truth and that sort of thing. And so it's either the principle of care, it's the principle of wonder, it's the generative principle. essentially what we're saying is that that G is the principle that takes you out, that is that driving force that pushes you out of the underworld and up into the heavens. It's that invisible hand that just pushes you up and into the sky. Whether it be wonder, whether it be care, or what have you. They're all kind of basically the same principle, but essentially it's labeled as either care, wonder, or whatever. So that's, you see that G kind of written in the sash there behind the fellow craft, who is also on the wisdom pillar right there too, you'll notice. And so if we're assuming that we're climbing the ladder and not leaving, you have just behind the generative principle, you have the key that's tied to the rung of the ladder there. Is that the fourth rung? I'm not sure. But anyway, so you lose your anchor, you gain the generative principle, acquire the key to the Stargate. And I'm not a Mason. And if someone out there is a Mason, maybe you can clue me in. But if I was a betting man, I would say that that key is the secret word of the Master Mason, which is equilibrium. So I'm told. And so you gain the generative principle, you gain the secret word, and that allows you to enter the Stargate, which is up here, which is that solar transformational principle, way up there on the top left-hand side of our picture here. Now, and then you have, of course, the person who's sitting on top is called the Master Mason. That's the third degree of Freemasonry. You have the first degree, second degree, and third degree. And the Master Mason is the one who's achieved gnosis, who knows the secret word, who's done all the background work, and is now set free to achieve illumination. The illumination of the sun, that transformational principle of wisdom. So, and this person is holding something. It's kind of hard to tell, but this person is holding some children in their arms, a couple of naked babies. And that, I don't know for sure what that means, but if I was a betting man, I would say that is the acquisition and utilization of the generative principle, which is the birth of new things into creation. If I was a betting man, just in a way of reading these symbols, that's how I would see it. So something else to bear in mind is you'll notice that these three figures are out looking towards you. Right? They're looking through the Temple of Solomon out towards the viewer. Now this is where blinds come in, when it's very, very sneaky. And this is something to keep in mind, is that almost all esoteric symbology is written as though you're standing inside of the temple, so to speak. So you have to, let's say if I'm holding out a spear in front of me, right? If I was the person taking a picture of that spear, if I was the person taking a picture of, let's say, myself holding the spear, like if I was going to do a selfie, for example, the spear looks one way, but if I'm looking at it through a first-person view, the spear looks another way. Or if another way of looking at it is the way the symbol is meant to be read is as though you were standing inside the picture looking out at the viewer. Like you were one of these figures here on the ladder. That is how the symbol is meant to be read. You understand? It's confusing. It's done that way on purpose because it reorients all the elements inside the picture. So like if you're standing inside the picture looking out, like if this frame that we're looking at is actually the door to the Temple of Solomon, the strength pillar would be on the right-hand side, which is the masculine side of the body. Your sword hand, right? And the masculine principles also represent, the things that are sent out into the universe. So a sword is the principle that attacks and goes out and creates effectual change. And then you have the beauty side, which is the feminine side, which is the shields, your shield arm. And that's energy received into itself. It's like an electric current. What goes out has to come back. And so you have the beauty pillar would therefore be on the left-hand side. Okay, so I know it's confusing. I get it. It's not easy, but that's just the way esoteric symbols are read, and that's done that way on purpose, to keep the secrets and keep people so that only the people who are initiated into these mystery schools can understand the truth of it. And again, if you follow Mark Passio, he also discusses this. So you don't have to take my word for it. There's other people who talk about this as well. And he's a very fantastic resource for a lot of this kind of stuff. He's been at this work, frankly, longer than I have when it comes to Freemasonry. And he knows a lot more about it than I do. Like I said, I come from a totally different side of things. His mystery school he came out of and left was the Church of Satan, and came into the light out of that horrible place. And I came up through the Norse mysteries. Anyway, so, and let's see how I've been talking for a while. See, also my mouse isn't working. Come on, mouse. Come on, mouse. I'm talking about for about an hour now. Okay. We have a lot of stuff to cover, so I'm not going to fret too much. But we're getting towards the end here. And so, we're talking about green language, and I am looking here at my notes. Just I want to make sure I touch on this. And maybe I already did, but I want to just cover it. So the center pillar there is called the Ionic pillar. And again, that's more green language. That's the pillar of the eye. Ionic, eye, the pillar of the eye. These things are all done on purpose. And I don't remember if I had said that or not, but it's important. So the center pillar, where that the second initiate is sitting on, is the representation of thought, creation, or specifically the beloved Son. It's the thing. We talked about the upward pointed triangle before, and what that represents, the Holy Trinity. The beloved Son is the unification of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine principles. And it's the principle of creation. It's that thing that brings something new out of nothing. It's the thing that comes out of those two mental forces, phenomenons. Okay. I couldn't remember if I had actually done what I was supposed to and mentioned that or not. And I don't know why my darn mouse isn't working. Okay. Is it out of batteries or something? It's rather annoying. So now one of the things we need to do is we need to flip this whole thing on its side so that we're looking at it as though it's a map. So the north would be on the top, the south will be on the bottom, the west will be on the left-hand side, and the east will be on the right-hand side. You understand? So if you flip this whole thing on the side, suddenly we'll realize that this is a solar symbol. That the checkerboard floor actually represents the Earth. And you have those lines of latitude and longitude. And even in the background, you can kind of even see that it has even a slight curvature to it. And so the Joachim pillar, the strength pillar, becomes the Tropic of Cancer, where the sun is at its highest point. So one of the things you have to remember is most of these mystery schools came out of the Northern Hemisphere. And so they're all based on observing the sun from that perspective. So that's one of the things you should probably keep in mind here. So that when the sun is in the Tropic of Cancer, it's when the sun is at its highest power. So the strength pillar here, the Joachim pillar, that represents the Tropic of Cancer. That's when the sun is in its highest power. The Tropic of Capricorn, on the other hand, is when the sun is in the underworld, when the sun is in its lowest possible direction, which is where it's on its way now. I'm recording this in November of 2019, and the sun is on its way to the Tropic of Capricorn as we speak, and it will be there on December, I think it's 23rd this year. I could be wrong. I can't keep track of that very easily. Anyway, so that the dark sun, where you have it could either be the moon or it could be the sun in the underworld. There, it's where the place of darkness in the Tropic of Capricorn. And then you have, of course, the center pillar, which would represent the equator. The equalization of the two polar principles of darkness and chaos with the solar principles of light and order. So kind of what we're talking about, like we talked about with the Visica Pythias, I could never say it. The two circles, that create the almond shape in the middle. When we talked about the all-seeing eye, it's the female chaos creative principle, and then you have the masculine order creative principle. And so they come together to actually make those two things kind of come to fruition. And so that's what that eye represents. That's why it has both the elements of the lunar principle, the lunar symbol with the stars, and the solar principle. It's kind of an amalgamation of both those things. The principle of equality. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? When you turn it on its side, it turns into a whole different picture. I don't want to keep you for too long. I always try and keep these to be about an hour. So I don't want to go too long and run you all off. So I think maybe this might be a good place to start. There is, a lot more in there that, is beyond my knowledge base, such as some of the drawing tools in the map and that sort of thing. So I really highly encourage you to either read Manly P. Hall's book on Freemasonry, or his book on the secret teachings of all ages, which talks about Freemasonry in great detail. He also has a number of talks. And then, of course, you can also check out Mark Passio, who is a personal hero of mine, and I would love to meet. And he's one of the... there's a few people who inspired me to start teaching this stuff. And Mark Passio is one of the major ones who did that. Him and Jacob Israel are some of the two major influences I had on coming out and doing this. So I highly highly encourage you to check out Mark Passio. He is a very good man and very, very knowledgeable. All right. With that said, I hope you all have a really great day. I hope this wasn't too confusing. I feel like sometimes I make these things very confusing. So we have some merch if you want to buy some merchandise. For some reason, I think I forgot. I need to make sure I put that in my links category down below in the description box. So if you want to buy, Odinic Mysteries t-shirt or something like that, you could do that, or cell phone case, or maybe a sweatshirt, an awesome sweatshirt. And then of course we also have Patreon and Subscribestar if you want to send us some money. We also have a PayPal account and that sort of stuff if you feel inclined. No pressure. All right, I'll talk to you all later. You have a really great day, and be safe out there. Bye-bye.